So, this week we're going to have a quick look at the theology or the Christology of Origen of Alexandria. Now, Origen was considered probably the first great theologian of the patristic era, and he's got a pretty fascinating story actually. As an 18-year-old, Origen's father was arrested for his fervent Christian faith and was going to be tried and executed. Now, Origen was so committed to his faith and his family that he too wanted to die a martyr's death along with his dad. So on the day when the trial was to be, young Origen was going to get up and go and accompany his dad really through the whole process, even unto death. But his mum obviously didn't want to lose her husband and her son on the same day, so she did something what maybe a lot of mums would do. She actually hid his clothes. She hid his clothes so he couldn't get dressed, so he couldn't leave the house, and so he lived another day and was spared, and that's a great blessing really for the rest of us actually in the long run. So Origen then becomes a student at the School of Alexandria at the Catechesis, which is the school of discipleship. Now, the person who was the principal there, the main teacher, was called Clement, and Clement unfortunately was also arrested and escorted later to die a martyr's death. So young Origen is then appointed as the primary teacher and principal of this discipleship school at the age of 18. Now that might sound bizarre, but honestly he was such an intellectual genius, an extraordinary thinker, that it makes sense. Origen had a very wealthy and generous patron called Ambrose who gave generously to his cause, and so Origen hired himself a staff of writers and editors, and he was able to dictate and produce multiple books simultaneously and then have them written up, edited and published. So it's estimated in his lifetime he produced at least 2,000 volumes of theology, biblical commentary, and just the exposition of the Christian life. Probably his most important and well-known work is called On First Principles, and I've been reading that this week to try and get an understanding of Origen's primary theology. Now, it's a pretty encyclopedic introduction to the Christian faith, and what he's doing actually is really interesting. He's writing in what's called the pre-Nicene era, which is before the Council of Nicaea. Now, you might remember, if you've listened to some of my other videos, that the Council of Nicaea was the place and the time when the first guardrails, the first real infrastructure of Christology and theology are put in place for the church to articulate what it believes. And so Origen is writing before that, so he didn't actually have these guardrails or these reference points to help him articulate his theology. And so you'd call his theology both experimental and exploratory. He's trying to articulate, trying to understand, trying to explore the territory of this one God who is three persons. So he does it quite brilliantly. Does he make a few mistakes? Yep, he probably makes a few mistakes. Does he overemphasize and underemphasize? Yes, definitely. But there was one particular thought that I just wanted to share in light of our studies of Christology. It's when he is seeking to try and form an analogy to help us understand Christology. Who is this one who is fully human and fully divine? And the image that he uses is the scene as a blacksmith's workshop. And it's like the blacksmith takes this rod of iron and plunges the rod of iron into the white hot orange glowing flames of the furnace fire. Then what happens? Well, the rod of iron then assumes the heat, it assumes the energy, it becomes part of the furnace really, doesn't it? It absorbs whatever the furnace is emitting, the energy, the power of the heat and the fierce flame goes into the rod, and it becomes that, so that the rod is still iron, but if you're to look at it, it looks like a furnace that's embedded in the white hot coals. If you're to touch it, you wouldn't feel normal iron, you would feel heat, you would feel the furnace, you'd feel the flame. So that's him trying to analogize the life of Jesus, the personhood of Jesus being fully human, which is the rod of iron, and yet being and assuming and containing and actualizing, personifying the life of God as well, being the energy and the mystery of the furnace. So you have this beautiful analogy that tries to describe to us or somehow impart to us the beauty and the truth and the mystery of fully human and fully divine. Now, there's some limitations to his analogy, of course. It probably works best when we're imagining Jesus either on the Mount of Transfiguration or the Jesus of the book of Revelation, whose glory is emanating through. But it's a little bit hard to understand that analogy when we're thinking of the Jesus who is tired and sweaty and dusty and sitting at the side of the well in John chapter 4, speaking to the Samaritan woman, where his divinity is very hidden, you could say, it's discreet. So, but there's something beautiful going on there, I think, in what he's trying to convey in the ferocity and the energy and the whatness of the furnace and the fullness of the iron containing that. But one other thought that he also adds in there is an encouragement, which is this, that we are like the rods of iron as well. And under the leadership and the illumination of the Holy Spirit, as we absorb and receive the scriptures and the truth of God's gospel, we too start to feel the heat of the furnace. We too start to glow. We start to become a part of whatever it is that the furnace, the life of God truly is. We get to know some of that within ourselves by the ministry of the Word and the Holy Spirit. And so he uses it not only as Christology, but also as discipleship, to say, you know, Jesus shows us how this really works, but we too are invited into the heat and the energy and the power and the mystery of God's life, that we might exhibit that to our community. There's just a few brief thoughts from young Origen, and hopefully I'll leave those with you for a little bit of food for thought and for pondering. So see you again soon. Peace.